Anton Mussert said he was a patriot. He said he loved the Netherlands. And he said he had nothing against Jews. He claimed he simply wanted to lead his country through the biggest crisis in its history. Unfortunately, he decided the best way to do this was to try and deal with Hitler. As leader of the Dutch Nazi Party, it would bring him to abandon his principles and betray his people. Because of his actions, the Dutch suffered a famine on a terrible scale. And as a result of his collaboration, the Jews in his country were systematically and ruthlessly murdered.
The Dutch just still don't want to admit, really, that a lot of them did things which were wrong. I just didn't know really until much later how bad they were, some of them.
So why did Anton Mussert choose to side with the Nazis? Was he simply weak, naive, a dupe for Hitler? Or was he just an evil and pernicious collaborator? Anton Mussert was born in 1894 into a peaceful and prosperous country. Holland had not been involved in any major war for over 140 years and had been neutral ever since. From an early age, Mussert showed he had an analytical mind and studied civil engineering. He worked for the Utrecht Council, helping to design and build roads, rail, and canals. He was also a strong patriot. In the 1920s, he became active in several extreme right organizations. The emergence of extremism was seen as highly unusual in what had long been a harmonious society. But then came an event that would breathe life into his extremist beliefs. In 1929, banks and stock markets in New York crashed. The fallout spread like wildfire around the world, causing governments to collapse and businesses to fold. Thousands lost their jobs and began to starve. The economic depression was deeper and longer in the Netherlands than anywhere else in Europe, in part due to disastrous decisions by the Dutch government. With that government seemingly unable to cope, Holland's population sought out radical solutions: communism or fascism. Anton Mussert saw his chance. On the 14th of December 1931, he founded the National Socialist Movement, or NSB.
Die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
Mussert's NSB was modeled on Hitler's Nazi Party in Germany. It shared the Nazi beliefs of love of nation, a willingness to work, and in strength of leadership. As Hitler was soon to be the Führer, or leader of Germany, Mussert wanted to be the Führer or de Leider of Holland. Hitler had his brown-shirted thugs to reinforce his message. Mussert formed his own strong-arm squad, called the Mussert Guard. But the NSB had two key differences from the Nazis. It tolerated religion, and it was not anti-Semitic. Mussert even declared, "Every good Dutch Jew is welcome in our party." As the Great Depression sank deeper, Mussert sold himself as the savior of Holland. And he appeared to be hugely popular, addressing record crowds. Fear of communism was what drove most to the party. Mussert or Moscow became the NSB battle cry. The party membership grew quickly to over 6,000. Just 5 years after its formation, Mussert's NSB was such a success, it caught the attention of Hitler himself. Mussert was invited to meet the Führer in Berlin in late 1936. There he pledged his future cooperation in the fight against communism. Filled with pride, Mussert unleashed his party in a general election. But it won only 4% of the vote. It did even worse in local elections in 1939. The utter failure looked like the last straw for the NSB. But these would be the final elections they would fight. The Nazis would see to that. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Mussert thought his time had come. Seizing the moment, the NSB leader made contact with German military intelligence, the Abwehr, to discuss the Nazi annexation of Holland. He agreed to embark on a secret plot to kidnap the Dutch Queen, Wilhelmina. The man who claimed to be a staunch patriot was plotting an act of high treason. It would be the first of many betrayals of his people. But the plot was discovered, and several NSB members were arrested, though Mussert himself escaped and fled into hiding. But he wouldn't have to stay there for long. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany invaded Holland. Hitler's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, took the Dutch completely by surprise. 16,500 airborne troops were parachuted into the country. In the coastal town of Heemstede lived Hans Oppenheimer and his wife Rita. They had 3 children. The Oppenheimers were German Jews who had traveled to Holland via England in search of a better life. 9-year-old Rudy had no idea what lay in store for his family.
The Dutch were, of course, shooting at the planes. You could see these little puffs. In the end, you could see them hitting them. Those planes were burning, spiraling out of control, then sort of making a pirouette and dropping in the meadows which surrounded Heemstede. So with my friends, we cycled there to have a look at this, and we managed to get into the meadows and see all this junk lying there, really. We collected souvenirs, took it back to school, and had a great time. We swapped it.
The Germans made rapid progress, but faced pockets of stiff resistance, particularly in the city of The Hague and outside the port of Rotterdam. Rotterdam was Holland's second-largest city with 500,000 people. Capture of its huge North Sea port was seen by Hitler as vital to his plans for the conquest of Europe. On the 14th of May, the Germans served the Dutch commanders in Rotterdam with an ultimatum: surrender or be destroyed. No reply was received, and at 1:20 in the afternoon, the bombers came. The Rotterdam Blitz leveled almost the entire city. "25,000 homes were destroyed. 80,000 were made homeless. Rotterdam surrendered. The next day, Holland conceded defeat. Despite being married to a German prince, Dutch Queen Wilhelmina, fearing for her life, fled to London.
After a heroic struggle, my nation, that has attempted everything to maintain peace, is being overpowered by sheer superiority of force. But morally, we can never be conquered. Our spirit will remain unbroken because our conscience is clear.
With Holland now in his possession, Hitler needed someone to take charge. So he appointed Viennese lawyer Arthur Seyss-Inquart as his leader in the Netherlands. Seyss-Inquart had form. He'd been in charge of the Nazification of Austria in 1938. As a sign of his goodwill, he ordered the release of all Dutch prisoners of war. Then he dissolved Parliament and began plans to Nazify Holland. He addressed the Dutch people on the 29th of May, calling for cooperation of two Germanic peoples of the same blood. His aim was to unite the Dutch behind the Nazis. He then made overtures to the NSB. Anton Mussert came out of hiding and gathered his NSB supporters together. If Mussert was not actually prime minister, he was at least now the most powerful Dutch politician remaining in the country. Grabbing this opportunity, Mussert presented Seyss-Inquart with a bold plan. He suggested taking over Queen Wilhelmina's vacant role as head of state to become de leader of Holland. Seyss-Inquart treated the idea with courtesy, and Mussert was invited to meet Hitler on the 23rd of September 1940. Mussert presented the Führer with a plan to create a league of Germanic peoples in Europe. This so-called Nordic Federation would have Hitler as its leader, but individual countries would also have separate leaders. Mussert proposed himself as the leader of Holland. Hitler cleverly threw the ball back to Mussert by suggesting that first his country must embrace National Socialism and should be what he called re-educated. Mussert agreed, seeing it as an opportunity for the rebirth of his beloved Holland. It was the first time that the Nazis would take advantage of Mussert's naivety. Mussert held a series of NSB rallies asking the Dutch people to follow him. He told them he would be their leader and promised them a safer, stronger Holland.
Dutch people, my people, and I repeat the words of their hopes, to knock on Hitler's door and ask for a place in the new Europe. A Europe controlled by Hitler and Mussolini, a place according to their virtues and their abilities.
Mussert appeared to be getting what he wanted, but then the true face of Nazism was revealed. The Germans started to turn on Dutch Jews. In 1940, there were over 150,000 Jews living peacefully in Holland. The Germans had to move slowly, but gradually they imposed their will. They began by issuing the entire population with identity cards detailing their racial background. Then all Jews were dismissed from government jobs and banned from public places.
We couldn't use public transport anymore. We couldn't buy in normal shops. We had to buy in the Jewish shops, which would only open for 2 hours a day. We also had a curfew. It was pretty rotten, being a Jew, really. The worst, I suppose, was being home, to have to be in your flat at 8 o'clock in the evening in the summer.
In Amsterdam, Dutch collaborators assaulted Jews in the street. But the Jews fought back, and when a Dutch Nazi was killed, the reprisal was swift. 400 Jewish men were snatched off the street and disappeared. Mussert, the self-styled leader, was outraged. He'd promised his people he'd protect them. Now they were being persecuted. There was nothing he could do. So in protest, thousands marched through the center of Amsterdam. It was the first sign that his authority was waning. For 48 hours, the workers of the city went on strike in support of the Jews. But the Germans didn't care. They shot and killed 9 of the strikers. Fearing a bloodbath, the protest was abandoned. But faced with such opposition, the Germans hardened their approach. They sealed off the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, turning it into a ghetto. Within just a few months, Mussert's promise to protect his people was already ringing hollow. But his promise to re-educate his country was also ringing hollow to the Nazis. They thought the demonstrations showed that Mussert lacked the stomach for a fight. So Seyss-Inquart began to undermine Mussert by favoring other NSB members. The head of the Netherlands Bank was Rost von Tonningen. He was a supporter of Nazification, even wishing to see the Dutch language replaced with German. He was an unpredictable, rabid anti-Semite, and he frightened even Mussert. Seyss-Inquart now appointed von Tonningen as a co-leader of the NSB. With his position as NSB leader under threat, Mussert changed his moderate view on Jews. He agreed to expel Jews from the NSB and then launched a Jews Not Wanted campaign. It was yet another betrayal of his people. His dangerous game with the Nazis had taken a new, darker direction. And then came an opportunity to ingratiate himself with Hitler once again. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Mussert thought that Holland might ride on the back of Hitler's conquests, so he offered the Nazis his assistance. He launched a recruitment drive for young men to join a Dutch legion and fight for Germany.
Auf dem Marsch zum Bahnhof.
The legion was first sent to Germany for training. Then almost 3,000 were ordered to the Eastern Front at Stalingrad. They fought with courage and distinction, but suffered terrible losses. It would cause deep resentment in Holland. Mussert then made another attempt to win back credibility by making a bold power play. He requested a further meeting with Hitler, at which he publicly swore an oath. He declared, "I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, as Germanic Führer, loyalty unto death, so help me God." In return, He'd asked to be installed as the deputy Führer of the entire German Reich. Hitler refused, but Mussert's position was then undermined again by events on the other side of the world. The Dutch East Indies colony, modern-day Indonesia, was the jewel in the Dutch imperial crown.
Further evidence of the development of the Netherlands East Indies. A typical washing day scene in Batavia canals goes side by side with a busy scene in the harbour. And in the towns, there were fine modern buildings vying with beautiful examples of old Dutch architecture.
The Dutch East Indies was also a huge producer of oil. Japan, the Nazis' allies, had no oil of its own, and it was just waiting for an excuse to invade. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, and the US declared war on Japan. In response, Queen Wilhelmina also declared war on Japan. This gave the Japanese the excuse they needed. 9 days later, Japanese forces invaded the Dutch East Indies.
These then were the islands which acted as a magnet to the greedy little men of Nippon. And with the fall of Singapore, they advanced swiftly upon Java and Sumatra.
The Dutch rose up and set the country's oil stores ablaze to prevent the Japanese getting their hands on them. But it was hopeless. By March 1942, the Japanese had overrun the islands. 2,000 Dutch were killed and 60,000 captured. Mussert begged his Nazi friend to stop the Japanese. But Hitler ignored him. For Mussert, it was another disaster. His own citizens had been slaughtered by Hitler's allies. Mussert's promise to protect his people had been completely undermined. With Mussert humiliated by Hitler, his rivals in the NSB moved against him. Soon after invasion, the Germans set up an arm of their security police, the Dutch SS. It even incorporated the Mussert Guard. Its head, one of Mussert's principal lieutenants, was Hendrik Feldmayer. Now, under pressure from the Nazis, Feldmayer demanded his men take their future orders from Hitler. Mussert reluctantly agreed. So on the 17th of May 1942, 600 Dutch SS swore an oath of allegiance not to Holland, but Hitler. It was even renamed the Germanic SS in the Netherlands, and soon they would become involved in the Nazis' most terrible crime. Of all the Nazi-occupied countries of Western Europe, the Netherlands had the highest proportion of Jews. Consequently, it was there that the Nazi solution to the Jewish problem was most drastic. In June 1942, the roundup began. For the Jews, there was no way out. The country was surrounded by hostile territory. There was nowhere to run. They were trapped.
Before we moved to Amsterdam in April '42, they introduced this Jewish star. You know, I had to wear a Jewish star. And here you can see one of my stars, which I wore. The star always had to be visible on the left-hand side, so you had lots of them. You had one on your coat, one on your blazer, one on your pullover, one on your shirt. Whenever you took anything off, it was still visible. But we didn't mind really wearing them at the time, because I recall we had the craze in those days that kids liked wearing as many badges as possible.
Of course, 10-year-old Rudi Oppenheimer had no idea that the star was a way for the Nazis to identify their victims. Most of the rounding up of Jews was carried out by the Dutch SS. That included the old Mussert Guard. The Jews were sent to the Westerbork camp in northern Holland. Ironically, the Dutch government had built Westerbork as a refugee camp to house Jews escaping from Nazi Germany. It had even been built with Dutch Jewish money. It now became the main route to extermination. There was a railway line that ran directly to the Auschwitz and Sobibor death camps in Poland. In just 1 month, 11,000 were taken to the death camps. The rounding up and the transportations took place with Mussert's knowledge. All he requested was that former Jewish members of the NSB be spared. Even that was refused. Rounding up Jews was a lucrative business. One Dutch group, the Henneke column, took full advantage. Led by a Dutch mechanic, Wim Henneke, this special unit of 35 men, many of whom were members of Mussert's NSB, had agreed to clear the homes of the Jews after they'd been taken away. As in all other occupied countries in Europe, the furniture, clothes, and possessions of the Jews were stolen and redistributed in Germany. The Henneke column would invoice for their work, and it didn't take them long to realize how to make even more money. They would become bounty hunters. For each Jew they captured and turned in, Wim Henneke and his men received 7.5 guilders from the Nazis, equivalent to about £30 at the time. These are actual receipts given to Wim Henneke for the delivery of Jews. This is for a single Jew, date of birth 4th of August 1897. The second is for a family of 5 Jews in 1943. The total received, 37 guilders and 50 cents. The Henneke column were at their most active throughout 1942 and 1943, and it's thought they arrested between 8,000 and 9,000 Jews, including children. There is no record of Mussert doing anything to stop them. But the Dutch fought back. They began hiding Jews from the Nazis. The scheme was nicknamed the Onderdieker, or underdiving movement. An estimated 25,000 Jews were hidden during the war. Most famously Anne Frank, whose diary of her experience would become one of the most read books of all time. The Schwab family from Amsterdam managed to hide until the end of the war above a nightclub called the Alcazar. Harry Schwab even filmed his experiences with a small camera. These pictures reveal the cunning nature of some of the hiding places. Behind a wardrobe, under the stairs, or other secret compartments. Mussert knew what was happening and accepted it all. But by now he was fighting for his life. His power base was diminishing. His people had been slaughtered in the Far East. And now the Jews in Holland were being exterminated. He made repeated requests to meet Hitler, and finally got his meeting. Yet again, Hitler declined Mussert's idea to establish his Nordic Federation. but did give in to one request. He agreed to appoint Mussert de leader, not just of the NSB, but now of all the Dutch people. In Dutch, leider meant leader. But in German, and much to the amusement of Hitler, it had a less gracious meaning: unfortunate. Mussert returned to Holland, his credibility seemingly restored.
En gij, mijn Duitse kameraden, tot u zeg ik u.
In February 1943, Mussert and Seyss-Inquart held a joint Nazi-NSB rally, where Mussert pledged renewed support for the Nazis.
Met die duizenden die daarin zitten, dan zeggen wij Nederlandse kameraden tot u, mijn Duitse kameraden. Het zijn onze kameraden die daar zijn en wij staan en vallen met hen.
In reality, Mussert's new position was just a sham. As de leader, he'd have no political power. He would just be a consultant. But in the eyes of ordinary Dutch people, Mussert had now become the Nazis' top emissary in Holland. And despite being reviled by the general public, the NSB was still active. The Oppenheimer family were about to find out how.
We could see the German soldiers and policemen going through our road, and we also saw they left the road without having knocked on our door, because we kept on watching through the curtains a little bit. My parents, of course, always told us not to be near the windows, but children don't listen to that. And then suddenly, about half an hour later, they came back, and they straight away knocked on our door, straight to our door only, and took us away.
Rudy would take many years to discover who tipped off the Nazis.
And it was only when I came back after the war that the lady below us told me that her neighbors, who were living one house further down the road, that they were collaborators called NSB, National Socialist Movement, which were the Nazis in Holland, that they betrayed us.
The Oppenheimers ended up in the Westerbork transit camp.
The camp itself, I keep on telling people, wasn't too bad, really. It's quite small. It's only 500 meters by 500 meters. We got enough food to live on. We played football a lot outside the camp. I went to school there. They had a primary school. They obviously wanted to keep the camp clean, so each week you had to take a shower. You had a special bath card when it told you to go, and it would be stamped off. But the bad thing about it is it was called a transit camp, not for nothing.
Every Tuesday, a train would arrive at Westerbork, fill up with Jews, and then leave for the long journey to the death camps in Poland. The Oppenheimers, so far at least, had avoided being on the passenger list. But how?
We had a blue stamp on our ID card in Westerbork, which indicated that we were an exchange Jew because my sister Eve was born in Britain.
A family was classed as exchange Jews if one of them could prove they'd been born in any country the Nazis were at war with. This made them a valuable commodity. Exchange Jews could be swapped for German citizens imprisoned in other countries, such as Palestine and the USA. Eve Oppenheimer had been born in London in 1936 and had a British birth certificate. It qualified the family as exchange Jews.
We didn't have to go because there was some sort of rule by the commandant, who probably got the rule from Amsterdam, from the higher authorities, not to send those exchange Jews away. So we stayed there for 7 long months.
The Oppenheimers would be excused being listed for transfer, for now. As the harsh intentions of the Nazis and the NSB became clear, the Dutch people started to strike back. The Dutch resistance, fiercely loyal to their Queen of Orange, launched a series of attacks on prominent Dutch Nazis. In February 1943, the commander of the Dutch Legion, Lieutenant General Seyffardt, heard a knock at his door. As he opened the door, he was shot twice at point-blank range. 2 men fled the scene. Seyfarth died the next day, and the reprisals were swift. The Nazis took 50 men hostage and executed them. Faced with more resistance, the Dutch SS leader Hendrik Veldmayer embarked on Operation Silver Fur. Veldmayer assembled a 15-man death squad with the express purpose of carrying out retaliatory attacks against civilians. They murdered 54 Dutchmen, including the highly regarded political writer A.M. de Jong. Mussert was horrified. He bitterly opposed their actions and expelled Veldmayer from the NSB. He then demanded a further meeting with the Führer. But by now, Hitler had other things on his mind. In the Soviet Union, the German army was in full retreat. 100,000 men had been captured in Stalingrad. In North Africa, the British and American forces had Rommel's Afrika Korps surrounded. And the Americans were winning the war in the Far East. Hitler ordered the redoubling of the war effort. On the 18th of February, head of Nazi propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, called for total war.
Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
The Nazis ordered all Dutch soldiers whom they'd captured in 1940 to switch sides and report for duty in the Dutch Legion. Dutch workers responded by downing tools again and refusing to work for the Third Reich. This unprecedented strike led to the deaths of 80 by firing squad. Mussert was witnessing his country spiraling out of control. He'd lost command of his police. 100 NSB members had been assassinated, and thousands of men had died on the Eastern Front. On the 4th of December 1943, Mussert, his reputation in tatters, had his last meeting with Hitler. Hitler told him that he would never be granted any political power. Mussert and his NSB were totally isolated. Detested at home, rejected by Hitler. And all this time, the Nazis' murder machine was still operating. On the 31st of January 1944, the Oppenheimer family's luck ran out. They were on the dreaded transport list and reported to the railway siding, fearing the worst.
Well, in the end, it was our turn to go because on a Monday afternoon, they pushed the train into the camp again, as usual. But it was an ordinary train with seats.
They weren't to be taken to Auschwitz after all. In fact, all exchange Jews were being relocated to a very different camp in Germany.
At 3 o'clock we left, and then the rumor went round in the train we would go to Germany, to a place called Bergen-Belsen.
Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp. It had been a prison for enemies of the state, but now it was being used to detain exchange Jews.
We suddenly saw a very high double barbed wire fence. On the fence we noticed there were boards in German every 100 meters, that if you get too close to the fence they would shoot you without any warning. Around the fence we could see now these real watchtowers, which you never had in Westerbork, with searchlights and machine guns. It was called the exchange camp, since we were exchange Jews.
But this was the end of their preferential treatment.
Schooling was forbidden in Belsen, playing was forbidden in Belsen, entertainment, which we had in Westerbork, was forbidden. I think everything was forbidden, and we just worked 6.5 days a week.
But it seemed freedom was not far away. On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies opened the Western Front. On D-Day, British, American, and Canadian troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. With them, a 1,500-strong brigade made up of Dutch soldiers who'd fled Holland in 1940. Even now, with the Allies closing in and with Mussert rejected by Hitler, he rallied his few remaining supporters and begged them to carry on fighting for Holland. The fight was soon on their doorstep. On the 13th of September, the first Dutch city, Maastricht, in the south of the country, was liberated by the Americans. And when BBC radio Orange prematurely reported the liberation of the southern town of Breda, thousands of NSB members fled to Germany. But Mussert stayed to face the music. Across much of the country, the Dutch began celebrating wildly, believing they too would soon be free. But a tragedy was just around the corner. Just 4 days later, Operation Market Garden was launched by the Allies. The plan was to grab key bridges across the rivers Meuse and Rhine and cut off the Ruhr, the German industrial heartland. Over 40,000 airborne troops were dropped, and the bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven were taken. Queen Wilhelmina expected a swift Allied victory, and in support called for a national rail strike to coincide with Market Garden and cut off supplies to the German army. Railway workers walked out, bringing the Dutch rail network to a halt. But the Queen's optimism was premature. The British Army found the crossing at Arnhem a bridge too far. They were defeated, and the Germans wanted revenge. They cut off supplies of coal, gas, electricity, food, and water. Shops ran out of food. Stoves and fires burnt out. The Dutch scavenged what they could. It marked the beginning of one of the worst human tragedies of the war. As the Allies counterattacked, the retreating Germans blew up dikes, holding back the North Sea. Fearing the whole of Holland might be flooded, the Allies held back their final assault. The Nazis would not retreat, and the Allies could not advance. The stalemate left the Dutch in the west of Holland cut off, freezing and starving. The Dutch would later brand the coming months the Hunger Winter. This famine claimed the lives of 16,000, who died of starvation and the cold. Caught up in it was a severely malnourished 15-year-old ballerina who spent the winter eating flour from crushed tulip bulbs to stay alive and dancing to raise money for the resistance. Audrey Hepburn would survive the war, but would blame the famine for chronic illness suffered later in her life. All the while his people starved, Anton Mussert did nothing. Eventually, it was the Allies who brought an end to their suffering.
The Germans had agreed to complete immunity for Allied planes in 10 dropping zones from 700 hours to 1,500 hours daily. However, some bomber crews noted rifle and light anti-aircraft fire. In contrast to the days when Nazi planes brought destruction to Rotterdam, Allied planes were now bringing Dutch cities sustenance.
The RAF and the Americans dropped 11,000 tons of food. But conditions remained desperate for the Oppenheimer family inside the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Typhus had broken out, claiming the life of 15-year-old Anne Frank.
The Germans decided to bring the first survivors from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, and more of those people came, and our camp became now overcrowded. We got lice, we got typhus, and now, of course, all these weak people started to die. Now my mum got ill, and she was put in a hospital barrack. But of course, by that time, there was chaos in the camp. There were no longer doctors or medicine or anything like that. A woman told me and the rest of the family that my mama died. And of course, we were very upset about that. But then a few weeks later, my dad got ill, and he was put in a hospital barrack. And again, we visited him daily. But when we arrived there on the 20th of March, 1945, he was no longer lying in a bunk bed, and the guy who was lying there told me my dad had died.
By the spring of 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. Suddenly, Rudy, his brother and sister, were ordered out of the camp and onto another train. They were kept on the move so they might be traded for German prisoners of war. If only they'd stayed a few more days.
I gathered that 5 days after we left the railway ramp, we left it on the 10th of April 1945, the British Army entered the camp and liberated it. But of course, I wasn't there anymore.
From every corner of Europe, German troops are making the long trek back to the remains of their Third Reich. This contingent marches through Holland, whose people have felt the full weight of the Nazi jackboot.
On the 5th of May 1945, the commander of 117,000 German troops in Holland surrendered. The German army threw down their guns and marched home. Queen Wilhelmina returned to her country to rapturous crowds.
In every Scheldt town where bitter battles raged a few months ago, the people gathered to welcome their queen. Here, where the grey winter's war left scars, the queen talks to the humble people who never stopped fighting for their liberty.
After the victory came the reprisals. In Holland, over 120,000 were arrested for collaborating with the Nazis. Hundreds of women were beaten, had their heads shaved, and even painted orange for having relationships with Nazi soldiers. Men who'd fought with the Dutch SS were made to clear minefields. Anton Mussert was arrested on the 7th of May and charged with high treason. He was brought to a special court for trial at The Hague in November. And after just 2 days was found guilty and sentenced to death. Having lost an appeal, Mussert begged the Queen for clemency. She refused, and exactly a year to the day after his arrest, he was executed by firing squad. So what are we to make of Anton Mussert, the Dutch collaborator? As his country was invaded and its leaders fled, his defense was that he alone could be trusted to shield his people from the horrors of war. He promised to protect the Dutch, but he sent thousands of young men to their deaths fighting for the Nazis and was powerless to stop the slaughter in the Dutch East Indies. And having once openly embraced the Jews and their culture, he stood by as 107,000 of them were exterminated by the Nazis. In his attempts to reason with Hitler, he failed to grasp the demoniacal nature of the Nazi regime. For his failure to see the truth, he paid the ultimate price. Paul, Eve, and Rudy Oppenheimer were liberated by the Russians and were eventually found by their uncle and aunt. Had Eve Oppenheimer not been born in Britain and qualified her family as exchange Jews, it's more than likely all would have been gassed. Today, Rudy and Eve Oppenheimer both live in London.